So Dr. Gushee, this shame that white people are going to require deep healing from. I think you're so right when you say it has to be done in community with white people and Black and brown people. And yet I feel like white people often expect Black and brown people to do it for them somehow. To fix things, to make it, you guys solve it. And while that's how we've gotten, I think as far as we've gotten is brilliant, incredible Black and brown people who have sacrificed so much and stepped up and done really creative things to change our society and our political system. One thing that they cannot do for us as white people is heal our shame. How do we start that process? Can it be done on a collective level? Is there a role that the church plays, or any other, any religious bodies? Is there a role that politics plays? Where does it start?
Let me begin by saying I totally agree that we absolutely have to do this work ourselves, that we cannot ask Black and brown people to heal us from this history and the shame associated with it. So that's absolutely the case. For me, I can just tell you, it has involved peeling back the layers of ignorance. I think at the beginning is just simply telling the truth. But because I'm not capable of telling the truth about this myself, I have to read others who have been telling the truth for a long time, read and listen to. Mm-hmm. So for my 2018 American Academy of Religion presidential address, I felt the way to do that was just to immerse myself in novels by African American writers. Yeah. And so I just read novels for a year, and again, because I never had a class like this, I was doing this without any history. Mm-hmm. So I read, Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin and Ernest Gaines and, a dozen others, Octavia Butler. I went to school on African American novels, and I dialogued as I was developing my address. I dialogued with a growing number of African American ethics and theological friends, in the academy that I know, and that are now not strangers to me, but have become friends and colleagues, right? So here's what I see. What am I missing? Here's a section I've drafted. How does this read? I immersed in, and novels were a great way to do this. Mm. Katie Cannon, who graduated from Union and who birthed womanist ethics, also birthed a methodology that paid attention to novels. And so I was actually, in a sense, following a womanist methodology, Black feminist women's, Black women's ethics, to engage novels by especially Black women writers to pierce my ignorance. And what I asked of those novels for my address was, what do they notice and say about white people? And that's not the only thing to notice about those novels at all, but that was where I started. And I said a lot of truths that were unanimous. It was like, in fact, the discovery I made was their depiction of white people was more or less obvious to them. It was like, well, I mean, that's just, obviously everybody knows that white people are messed up by their privilege and that their racism distorts their character and that their religion has very little value in changing it. And the novels are not mainly about that, but the novels depict that on the way to depicting, African American struggles for dignity and justice. So my path was, well, partly growing commitment to reading and knowing and deepening relationships with people outside of the white community, attempting some intellectual projects in which I could not have a shot at doing them decently unless I was in dialogue deeply And and my heart changed in the process. My understanding of the history changed. I wasn't able to live in lies, and the shame feels transitional in a sense. Like, you don't want to live in shame. You want shame to maybe be a tool to help you get to truth and healing and commitment. And so I don't really feel shame at this point. I feel empowerment to want to make a constructive difference. But
Right.
the shame was a signal that there was something wrong that needed to be dealt with.
Right. And it would be wonderful if, there could be a trend in white culture that would recognize that shame is actually a tool that we can use instead of becoming defensive about it. When you bring up the narratives in Black novels, the first thing white people do is try to flip it. Oh, well, you're being racist,
Right.
just almost comical in its horror. And so, looking at ways that white culture can, instead of being ashamed of mistakes and missteps, start to take pride in the ability to unearth those and use those as stepping stones to evolving white culture, educating white culture, creating space for repentance, or looking at the world in a new and different way. Do you think it's possible? And do you think it's possible in this political climate? And do you think, anything positive can come out of this, like, gross, like, backsliding that we've, seen for the past 4 years?
Um, once your heart changes on this, then and you're past the shame, though you get stabs of shame. Like when I read about lynching, I get stabs of shame, right? But just kind of a renewed sense of being appalled. But that, but mainly, I want, as a teacher, I want to bring students on the journey that we're talking about towards constructive change, right? Um, so like I now teach a class on great moral leaders that includes serious engagement with Black and brown leaders. And so when we read Ida B. Wells Barnett talking about lynching, or Harriet Tubman's story, or Martin Luther King's story, or Nelson Mandela's story, or whatever, you you just overcome the ignorance with reality. You read awesome writings that kind of shatter the ignorance, and then you're teachable, hopefully, to go on the journey of growth. I mean, I think that every educational setting, every seminary, every college, every high school, and certainly every church, even if it is a white dominated demographic, ought to be able to, in fact, ought to be committed to helping people be on that journey. So imagine a church, a mainline church somewhere full of 98% white people doing a study group for 15 weeks on African American novels, or the writings of James Baldwin, or whatever. If we outsource that to the visiting Black person,
Right.
it's like we're saying we don't really do this work.
Right. We don't want to change. We don't want to do it. Come do it.
We're going to hire you to do this work in our presence, or to be the expert on this other thing, that we don't really know anything about. It's not, it's not about understanding Black culture, that part of it. It's really about understanding the history of white supremacism and racism. We have to do that work, and we don't have to, and we can develop our own expertise in doing that work. In fact, we must. So the churches ought to be a space. As for the political moment, I would say that the president's appeals to white defensiveness are so bald, so obvious right now, that there's no subtlety to them at all, that, like so much else about him, he has a minority of people saying rah rah, but that minority may be very ardent, but not decisive. But I think he's helping to harden them,
Mhm.
and their hardening is very scary to me and very sad. You see the faces at the rallies, and you see what you're dealing with, right?
Mhm.
But I think that what happened after the George Floyd incident, the spring and summer, the multiracial nature of the rallies, the the especially young people. There's a shifting percentage of white people, a growing percentage of white people who get it, and they want to be part of a better future. And uh, that's where the hope is.